Hey guys, welcome to part 2 of developing your first web application. In this video, we're just going to cover the 4 basic operations on data. That means create, read, update and delete. And to do this, we're going to use the same API that we created in last video. If you want, you can check out the video, but it's not a necessity here. If I talk about the real world implications of these 4 operations, if we take the example of Facebook, every time someone creates a new account, they use the first C, that means the create operation. Every time someone opens your page or opens your profile, the read operation is used. Every time you update your profile, or let's say you update your birth rate, the U or the update operation is used. And every time someone deactivates their account or deletes their account, the delete operation or the D is used. So that makes up CRUD, which is the basic building block of almost every web application. Before we get into this video, please hit the like button and subscribe to this channel, and please leave a comment on what I can improve throughout the course of this video, and also on what you would like to see next. Thanks. Okay, so as you can see over here, I have the application that we developed in the last video ready. For those of you who don't remember, we had created an HTML page which fetched data from our backend. And if you check that out, this is our HTML page which was using jQuery, and it just did a simple get request onto our backend's URL and set the data according to whatever we received. So this is our backend where we return, hi John, the time is whatever the time is at the moment. And if I just go over here, hi John, the time is so and so. And if I hit the URL directly, we can see that this is where the data is getting populated from. Before we jump into CRUD, I have actually uploaded whatever code we've written up till now onto a GitHub page, which is right here. And so this week's code as well as last week's code is going to be updated here. And whatever future we plan with this series, I'll keep putting up the code over here. I'll leave the link for this in the description. Alright, so let's jump into CRUD. If you remember, this was a Flask file which said that at route / this is what we want to return. Now let's create 4 routes. One is going to be called, let's call this create, read, update, delete. So our CRUD operations. And if you check this out, by default, whatever function you define under the route is always a get request, measured as a get request. So we need to add something called requests. So if we come back to the quick start guide, you can see that you can define what methods are allowed on this particular URL. So if I just copy that from there, and yeah. So since this is a create route, when creating something, we would always want a post request. The basic difference between a get and a post would be that get cannot send form data. It cannot send huge amounts of data. It can only send data using query parameters, which we will check later in the video. Whereas in post, we can send an entire object which we want to write. So for create, let's just allow post method, and we'll call this the function create. That's not how you spell create. Okay, and we'll get down to the return a little later. And for read, similarly, in read we would want a get method, since when reading something we would only want the ID field of the data or the name of the user, stuff like that, which can be easily put in the query parameter rather than sending a form data again. So let's say def read return, let's just name this read for now. Okay, and as for our update, similar to post, similar to the create method, we're going to use the post method over here. Why? Because again, update, we would almost be getting the same type of data we got while creating. So update, and lastly we have delete. Now in delete we have a new method coming over here. It's called the delete HTTP method. And with delete you can actually send a form type of data. So you could send ID fields, you could send whatever you need to, whatever you require for a certain delete operation to happen, and it will do whatever you require it to do. So in our case, how we are going to do this is we are going to create a simple data object. I don't want to introduce any database querying or stuff like that in this episode. If you want that, you could just drop a comment and we could go from how much ever we see. Okay, so let's define the data that we require. So let's make it an array. An array just means a list of, and what we're going to do is in our create method we're actually going to add stuff to this array. In our update method we're going to update certain indexes. In read we're going to fetch the data at that particular index, and in delete we're going to remove that data. So sounds pretty simple. Right, in create, now before we actually start accessing the data that has come in from the post request, we would have to import something called request from Flask. So since this is just a post method, ideally you would want to put a condition here called if request.method is equal to post, but this would not be required since the only allowed method here is post. So we have post and we have request dot data. Let me just confirm that fact. Again, always refer to that quick start guide. It is crucial it's crucial to just get the basics or the hang of anything you want. Cool. So if you see over here, we have post and we have request.form, which contains the data that we want. So there's form, and let's say whatever we are passing from a front end, this is our choice. So we're going to go with let's call it a name. So we have the name of the user or whatever data, whoever is entering the data is putting in a name, and we're going to add this to our data object. Ideally this would be our database. So we do data.append name. Append just adds to the list, and that's it. And now we return done. If there is any exception or any error that happens in the code, our URL will return a 500, which means a server error. That should not be happening in our case. Now let's come into this method called get. Now in the get field, we want the index that is coming in. So our URL will actually be /read/1 or 2 or 3 or 0, depending on whatever the request from the user is. So if you just check out the quick start guide again, you can see that in the route we have a /user/username in their example. So ours would be /index, and if you see, there's an angular bracket around it which makes it a query parameter. Query parameter is the only way a GET request can send data in a way from your user facing service, our website, to the backend. So, and in this case we only need the index to get that object. We don't need an ID field, we don't want to know which table it is stored in. So we have index and we just add it to that function which we declare, as you can see over here. And cool. So we say the name that we've gotten from our database from index, and we return that name. As simple as that. Coming to the update request, which is again a post request. So if you remember what we did on top, we got the name from the request.form, and so now we have to make this in a way that we want the existing index that needs to be updated as well as the new name that we want to update. So let's call this field the index and new name, request.form, let's call it new name. Okay, just a small thing about the naming convention. Python usually uses underscores between each word, whereas in other scenarios like JavaScript we would use camel case. No, this is not camel case, I forgot what it's called. First one's small and the rest are big. Alright, so now that we have the index, all we need to do is data of index should be equal to new name and return done. Successful. Coming to delete, we'll come back to delete a little later. Okay, so let's test out our API now, and the easiest way to do that is from our browser, and we're just going to read our data for the URL, let's say on index 0. Now if you see, this is going to give us an error. Every time your application gives you an error, always just go to the terminal and you can see what the error exactly was thrown. In this case, if you notice, it's going to be, the list indexes must be integers and not string. So if you come back here, you notice how we got the index from the query parameter. This is always going to be a string. Even though we know that 0 is an integer, our system is not smart enough to understand that. So we're just going to make this int, and then we just have converted our 0 into an integer, and we restart our application, and there you go. For reading at position 0, if you notice, our 0 position is web, and if I make this 1, we're going to return an application. And if you make it anything more than what we have, it's going to throw an error because our database is not that big yet. Okay, for testing your APIs for the post request, I would suggest to use something called Postman. At the moment, we're going to test directly by integrating it into the front end and making a post request from there. But usually, if you're developing just the backend, you could use something called Postman too. I'll leave a link for that in the description. Cool. Alright. So if you see, I've just created an input field over here for type of number. And now what we're going to do is we're going to get an input from the user. So I'll just show you on the UI. This is how that input field is going to look. It only accepts numbers. You can't enter any text in here. Okay. Now depending on whatever index the user has put in, we are going to get that data. So let's make a button called fetch. Close the button, and we're gonna have an on-click handler for this, and on-click we'll call a function that you define in your JavaScript. So this is gonna be a function fetch data. Okay, fetch data, just sticking to the naming convention here, and we're going to make a get request similar to what we done in the last video. But this time our URL is going to be different. This time our URL is going to be read/0 or 1. So we're going to get that data index is equal to whatever the user has put in input. So we're going to use the same thing here. Our ID here is index, and this is going to become value. So now that we have our index, we're just going to put it into our URL. So whatever the user inputs, we're going to fetch from there. So on click, fetch data, and we're going to click on fetch 1. So if you click on 1, you're going to get 1 over here. If you click on 0, you're going to get web. And if you click on 15, it's going to throw an error, so it's not really going to update our thing. If you see, I've opened the console over here. You can see that there was a 500 an internal server error for getting 15. Cool. So now let's create an API. We've already created the API. Let's create it on the front end as well, so that we can add to our list. So now that we have created fetch, I'm just going to make this a little prettier and just say read, and the next one's going to be create. We're going to do a similar thing. We're going to get an input. We're going to call it a type text. ID this time is going to be new name, and similar name. And we're going to have a button which is now going to say create data and create. So let's make that function, called create data. This time we're going to get a name from very similar as to how we've done the previous one, and just instead of index we're going to get it from new name, and we're going to call the variable new name. Okay, and now we're going to do a post request. If you remember, in jQuery we do a get request using $.get. This time we do it from $.post. So we're going to put in the URL over here. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to make a variable called backend URL. Alright, so now we're going to fetch backend URL plus this is our create, so our create slash nothing, because if you just come back to our Python file, it just slash create. The rest of the data is going to go through form parameters, and to add form parameters in using jQuery, we just make it an object. So the key of our object is going to be name, like we mentioned over here. So this is going to be name, and our value is going to be whatever the new name is, so new name. And dot then, again the explanation for dot then was in the last video, you can check that out if you want to. Document dot, so we've just gotten the data. I'm just going to log this for now, and let's see what happens. And we're going to create a field called application, create, and we got it done. That means our field was created. So now ideally if we read index 2, it should return application. So we had 0 which said web, 1 which said web application, and 2 as well which now says application. So if we call the next one development, create, again we received a done, and now we get on 3, we're going to get development as well. So we have read done, we have create done. Let's make update. So for creating update, again just going to create a simple section here. Now we want the updated name here, and the other thing that we want is the existing index. So this is going to be of type number, and we're going to call it existing index. Cool. Our function is now going to be called update data. Again, if we go back to the update one, it is a post request to slash update, and index the new name are the two fields that our backend requires. So we're going to make it $.post onto our URL. This time it's going to be update. Instead of name, it's called new name, and our value is called updated name, and it's going to be our index is going to be existing index. Alright, so let's refresh. So this is going to take the existing index. So let me just read on 0 first. We have web 0, and let's make web World Wide Web for no reason at all, and click on update, and there was an error. If I remember what might have gone wrong, it's because we didn't convert our index into an integer field, and you can always verify that by looking at the server error as well. Just going to restart, click get 0, cool, server is working, and we are going to just update 0 World Wide Web update, and we got it done. So if we fetch on 0 again, you can see that it's updated to World Wide Web. So we have read, create, update done. Okay, so looking at delete, I've done the exact same thing as get. It's pretty redundant, so I've just skipped over that bit. It's the same, we just delete for an index, and depending on that index, we're just setting the data to nothing at the moment. So an example of that would be, let's read at 1, it's application, let's delete 1, so that would mean now application is blank. Let's fetch at 1, and we get nothing. You notice how it's not an error, it's nothing. It's because we haven't removed it from our database, we've just made it blank. Okay, so congratulations on learning the basics of CRUD and how any real world application manages its data. And you could actually expand on this and start maybe make your own social network, or maybe just somehow find a way to create a table instead of just having an array. Maybe start creating an array of objects and update that table on the basis of read, create, update, and delete, whatever user input you get. If you like this video, please hit like and drop a comment and let me know what you want me to do next. And don't forget to hit subscribe. Thank you.